My parents were not invited to my wedding. And the moment that decision was final, the moment I closed that chapter completely and without apology, I felt something I had spent years chasing and never quite catching. I felt free. Not the kind of free you feel on a Friday afternoon or the last day of a job you hated. I mean the kind of free that starts somewhere deep in your ribcage and expands until you can finally actually breathe. And I know that the second I said that, something shifted in you too, because you either just felt relief that someone finally said it out loud, or you felt a flash of judgment that you're already quietly reconsidering. Here's what I need you to understand before we go any further. This is not a story about hate. I did not wake up one morning, flip a switch, and decide to blow up my family. There was no dramatic single moment, no one villain, no Hollywood-style confrontation where I slammed a door and never looked back. What there was years. Quiet, confusing, exhausting years of trying to figure out why the people who were supposed to love me the most were also the ones who made me feel the smallest. And here's the question that kept me up more nights than I can count. What do you do when the people causing you the most pain are also the people the entire world expects you to protect? Because that's the trap nobody talks about. You can leave a bad relationship. You can quit a job that's destroying you. You can walk away from a friendship that drains every drop of energy you have. But parents? The moment you even whisper that your parents might not be the heroes of your story, the world looks at you like you've just confessed to something unforgivable. And for the longest time, that look, that fear of that look, kept me completely stuck. But I'm getting ahead of myself. And trust me, you need the full picture, because if I just hand you the ending, you'll miss the part that might actually change something for you today. So let me take you back. Not to some distant dramatic memory, but to something much quieter and much more unsettling. The version of me that had no idea anything was wrong. The version of me that thought what was happening inside my family was just normal. The version of me that had been so carefully taught to shrink that I didn't even notice I was doing it anymore. Because that's the thing about growing up in a home where love comes with invisible conditions attached. You don't question it. You just absorb it. You wear it like a second skin until one day someone looks at you and says something that cracks the whole thing wide open. And I'll tell you exactly what that was. I'll tell you about the relationship that held up a mirror and showed me what I'd been living inside. I'll tell you about the engagement that set off a chain of events so calculated, so coldly deliberate, that even now I have to pause when I talk about it. And yes, I will tell you every detail of the decision to uninvite them, the conversation, the silence after it, the way my hands felt, all of it. But right now, I want to leave you with the one thing I wish someone had said to me 10 years earlier. Choosing peace is not the same as choosing wrong. And sometimes the most radical, the most terrifying, the most necessary act of love you will ever perform is the one you perform for yourself. Stay with me, because this story is just getting started. Have you ever looked at your childhood photos and realized the smile on your face was never really yours? I was 7 years old the first time I remember performing happiness. Not feeling it, performing it. We were at a family gathering, the kind with too much food and too many opinions, and my mother straightened my dress, looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Smile, everyone is watching." Not "Are you having fun?" Not "Do you need anything?" Just smile because we have an audience. And I smiled. I smiled so wide my cheeks hurt. And everyone said what a lovely, well-behaved little girl I was. And my mother looked satisfied. And somewhere in that exchange, without either of us realizing it, a deal was struck. My job was to look good. Her job was to take the credit. Now I want to be careful here because I know what some of you are thinking. Lots of parents say things like that. Lots of kids are told to behave at family events. And you're right. Isolated, that moment means nothing. But here's what I've learned about patterns. They never announce themselves. They don't show up wearing a sign. They build slowly, one small moment at a time, until one day you look around and realize the walls have been closing in for years, and you never even noticed. My father was different in his approach but identical in his impact. Where my mother operated through image and appearance, what the neighbors thought, what the family would say, how things looked from the outside, my father operated through silence. His disapproval didn't come in words. It came in the temperature of a room. It came in the way he could make you feel invisible without ever once raising his voice. I used to think that made him the calmer one. It took me an embarrassingly long time to understand that cold and calm are not the same thing at all. And here's the hook that I need you to feel right now, because this is the part that will either resonate so deeply you have to pause the video, or it will make you deeply uncomfortable, and either reaction means it's already hitting something true. I was not an unhappy child on paper. I had food, shelter, clothes, school. There was no screaming household, no obvious chaos. From the outside, my family looked like exactly what a family is supposed to look like. And that presentable, functional, perfectly arranged exterior was precisely the problem. Because pain that looks normal from the outside is the hardest pain in the world to trust. It's the kind of pain that makes you question yourself before you ever question them. I spent so much of my childhood being the solution to their image rather than the subject of their actual love. Every achievement I had was immediately repackaged. My mother's dinner table story, my father's quiet nod of approval that I had to earn fresh every single time. I didn't get to just be proud of something. There was always a transaction, always a cost. And because I didn't have a comparison point, because this was simply the water I swam in every single day, I translated all of it into one very damaging personal belief, that love is something you qualify for. That you show up, you perform, you deliver, and then maybe if you've done it well enough, you get to feel loved back. I carried that belief into friendships, into school, into every single relationship I ever had. And the most frightening part of telling you this right now is knowing that some of you are nodding, not because my story is unique, but because you recognize the exact weight of what I just described. And that recognition, that's exactly why what happened next changed absolutely everything. What if the thing you called normal growing up was actually slowly breaking you? There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly managing other people's emotions while completely abandoning your own. Doesn't hit you all at once. It accumulates. Like water damage behind a wall. Invisible on the surface, devastating underneath. And by the time I was in my late teens, I was carrying a weight I didn't even have language for yet. I just knew that being around my family required a version of me that had nothing left over for anyone else. I'd come home from visits feeling hollowed out, scraped clean, and I'd tell myself I was tired or stressed or just being oversensitive. Because that's the other thing they'd perfected, making my reactions always seem like the problem. My mother had a particular gift for reframing. If I was upset, I was dramatic. If I needed space, I was ungrateful. If I disagreed, I was disrespectful. Every emotional response I had was immediately redirected back to how it was affecting her. I'd come to her with something that hurt me, and somehow within 3 sentences, the conversation had completely flipped and I was the one apologizing. I want you to really sit with that for a second, because if you've never experienced it, it sounds almost too calculated to be real. But it wasn't calculated in the villainous sense. It was just so deeply practiced, so completely automatic, that it had become her native language. And I had become fluent in it without ever choosing to learn. My father's pattern was slower, but it carved deeper. His was the pattern of the moving goalpost. Every time I came close to something that felt like his genuine approval, a good grade, a good decision, something I'd worked hard for, the standard quietly shifted. Just far enough that I was always reaching. Always one step behind something I couldn't quite name. And the insidious genius of that particular dynamic is that it doesn't feel like control. Feels like motivation. Feels like he just has high standards. It took me until my mid-20s to finally understand the difference between someone who believes in your potential and someone who uses your potential as a leash. And here is where I need to stop and say something directly to you, because this is the part of the story where people start to feel uneasy. Not because what I'm describing is extreme, but because it isn't. This isn't a story about monsters. It's a story about people who loved in the only way they knew how, and how that way was slowly, quietly, consistently not enough. And the reason that makes people uncomfortable is because it forces a question that most of us would rather not ask. What if the harm doesn't have to be intentional to be real? Because I spent years giving them the benefit of that question. Years telling myself they meant well, they did their best, they came from difficult backgrounds themselves. And all of that was probably true. But here's what I eventually had to reckon with. Intention doesn't determine impact. You can mean well and still leave damage. You can love someone and still be the reason they don't know how to love themselves. And the moment I stopped measuring their behavior by what they intended and started measuring it by what it actually produced in me, the pattern became impossible to unsee. I started noticing it everywhere. In the way I apologize for things that weren't my fault. In the way I physically brace myself before calling home. In the way a certain tone of voice from either of them could collapse an entire good day in seconds. These weren't coincidences. These were receipts. A long, detailed, undeniable record of what years inside that dynamic had built inside me. And then I met someone who showed me exactly what I'd been missing. And everything I thought I understood about love cracked straight down the middle. Have you ever met someone who made you realize how little you've been loved before? I wasn't looking for anyone when I met her. And I say that not as a romantic cliche but as a literal fact. I was at a point in my life where I had quietly, almost unconsciously, decided that the version of love I'd grown up watching was simply what love was. Transactional. Conditional. Something you had to continuously re-earn or risk losing. I hadn't made a conscious decision to accept that. I had just never been shown anything different long enough to believe something different was real. So I wasn't looking. I was just existing inside the story I'd been handed and calling it fine. She came into my life the way the most important things usually do. Not with dramatic music or a lightning bolt moment, but quietly, through a Tuesday that looked exactly like every other Tuesday. We were in the same space, we started talking, and something happened that I genuinely did not have a framework for at the time. She listened to me without waiting for her turn to speak. She asked questions that went deeper than the surface answer I'd offered. And when I deflected, which was my default, my armor, the thing I did so automatically I barely noticed it anymore, she didn't push, but she also didn't pretend she hadn't noticed. She just held the space open, like she had all the time in the world and nowhere more important to be. I want you to understand why that was so profoundly disorienting for me. Because I had spent my entire life in relationships, family, friendships, everything, where love came packaged with an undercurrent of urgency. Perform now. Deliver now. Be what's needed right now, or feel the chill of disapproval settle in. And here was this person who was just steady, consistently, almost frustratingly steady. And my first reaction, and I'm not proud of this but I'm telling you anyway because it matters, my first reaction was suspicion. I kept waiting for the condition. I kept scanning for the catch. I kept bracing for the moment the temperature of the room would drop and I'd find out what I'd done wrong this time. It never came. And that absence of punishment was the most destabilizing thing I had ever experienced in my life. Which tells you everything about the blueprint I've been operating from without knowing it. Here's where it gets important, and stay with me because this is the thread that pulls everything else together. As she got closer, as the relationship got more real and more serious, something began shifting in me that had nothing to do with romance. I started seeing my own life from a slight distance for the first time. The way you sometimes catch your own reflection in a shop window and for just a split second before your brain catches up, you see yourself the way a stranger would. She was that window. And what I saw when I looked through her eyes at the life I'd been living was not comfortable viewing. She never once told me my parents were a problem. I want to be absolutely clear about that because what came later will be twisted by some people into a narrative about outside influence, and I will not let that stand. She didn't plant a single seed of doubt about my family. What she did was far simpler and far more devastating. She just loved me without an invoice attached. And in doing so, she made the contrast impossible to ignore. Because when you finally experience something real, the imitation you've been accepting your whole life stops being invisible. It becomes the only thing in the room. And my parents, without doing a single new thing, were suddenly finally impossible to unsee. And that's when everything began to unravel. Why do some parents treat their child's happiness like a personal attack? The first time my mother met her, she smiled the entire evening. And I mean that as a warning, not a compliment. Because I knew that smile. I had grown up inside that smile. It was the company smile. The one she wore like a costume when there was an audience present and an image to protect. It was warm and generous and completely hollow. And the moment the door closed and it was just the two of us, it dropped. Not dramatically. Not with a scene or a raised voice. It just quietly disappeared, the way a light goes out, and what replaced it was something I recognized immediately even though I'd spent years pretending it wasn't there. Calculation. She was already working on something. I just didn't know yet what it was going to cost me. The comments started small. They always do. A observation here, a question there, the kind that sounds almost reasonable if you're not listening carefully enough. She seems very confident, doesn't she? Said in a tone that made confidence sound like a character flaw. I just want to make sure she's right for you. Delivered with such practiced tenderness that for a moment I almost thanked her for her concern. Almost. But I had Module 3 living in my body by this point, even if I didn't have the words for it yet. I felt the pattern before I could name it. My stomach knew before my brain caught up. My father's response was different and in some ways more suffocating. He didn't comment on her directly, that wasn't his style. Instead, he started commenting on me. Subtle but surgical observations about how I seemed different lately. How I seemed distracted. How he hoped I wasn't losing focus on the things that mattered. And I want you to notice something about that particular tactic because it's important. He never attacked her. He attacked the version of me that existed when I was with her. The happier, looser, more alive version. As though my own expansion was evidence of a problem rather than evidence of growth. As though becoming more myself was somehow a betrayal of the self they had so carefully constructed for me. And here is the part that I need you to really absorb, because this is where the story stops being just my story and starts being something a lot of you might recognize from your own life. The escalation didn't happen because they hated her. I genuinely don't believe it was ever about her at all. It happened because she represented something my parents had spent decades quietly preventing. The possibility that I might build a life with its own gravitational center that didn't orbit around them. She wasn't a threat to their family. She was a threat to their architecture. The carefully designed structure in which I had a very specific role, a very specific function, and absolutely no permission to outgrow either. So the war, and I'm calling it that deliberately because that's what it became, didn't start with a fight. It started with a campaign. Phone calls that lasted just long enough to plant doubt. Dinners where the conversation was steered with such precision, I didn't realize until hours later that I'd been walked through an agenda. Family members I barely spoke to suddenly becoming very interested in my relationship choices. And underneath all of it, running like a current through every interaction, was a single unspoken message being transmitted on a frequency only I could hear. Choose carefully, because there is a right answer here and you already know what it is. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have predicted, was that for the first time in my life, I had someone standing next to me who made me feel like my own answer was worth something. And I was about to start listening to it. What happens when the moment meant to be the most joyful of your life becomes a battlefield? She proposed on an ordinary evening. No restaurant reservation, no choreographed moment, no audience. Just the two of us in our kitchen mid-conversation about something completely unrelated. And she stopped, looked at me with that steady, unhurried gaze I had come to understand was her most honest form of communication, and asked me to marry her. And I said yes before she'd even finished the sentence. Not because I hadn't thought about it, I had deeply, in the quiet, private way you think about things that feel too important to jinx by saying out loud. But because in that moment every single part of me that had spent years braced for the catch, waiting for the conditions, scanning for the cost, all of it went completely still. For the first time in my life, something enormous was happening and there was no fine print attached to it. I want you to hold that feeling for a moment. Because what I'm about to tell you is going to require you to remember it. I called my mother the next morning. I had rehearsed nothing, and that itself was new, because I had been rehearsing conversations with my mother since I was old enough to understand that the wrong word at the wrong moment had consequences. But that morning I didn't rehearse. I just called and I told her and I waited. The silence on the other end lasted exactly long enough to tell me everything I needed to know before she said a single word. And then she said, "Well, I suppose congratulations are in order." And something inside my chest that had been cautiously, carefully opening, quietly closed again. I suppose. Congratulations are in order. Not "I'm so happy for you." Not "tell me everything." Not the sound of a mother who just found out her daughter is getting married. A corporate acknowledgement. A statement so precisely calibrated to communicate disappointment, while maintaining deniability that I actually found myself apologizing for the timing of the call. I hung up and sat with that for a long time. And then I made the mistake of telling her we'd already started thinking about what kind of wedding we wanted, small, intimate, exactly us. And that's when the campaign stopped being subtle. Within a week, the architecture had fully revealed itself. My mother had opinions about the venue that were delivered as facts. My father had concerns about the guest list that were framed as wisdom. Extended family members were already being briefed. I know this because 3 separate relatives contacted me within 10 days with almost identical phrasing, which is not a coincidence, that is coordination. Every choice we made was met with an alternative suggestion that just happened to be more visible, more traditional, more centered around an image that served them rather than a day that served us. Our wedding was being quietly, systematically dismantled and rebuilt into something unrecognizable before we'd even booked a single thing. And here's the moment I need you to stay completely present for, because this is the pivot everything else balances on. One evening, after a phone call that left me sitting on the bathroom floor trying to remember how to breathe normally, she found me there. She didn't ask what happened. She already knew, the way she always knew, because she had watched this pattern play out enough times to read it in my body before I could speak it out loud. She sat down next to me on that cold tile floor and she said, "This is your wedding. Not a negotiation. Not a performance. Yours." And then she asked me one question that I have never forgotten and will never forget for as long as I live. She asked, "What do you actually want?" And the terrifying thing, the thing that cracked me completely open right there on that bathroom floor, was that I had absolutely no idea how to answer her. I sat with that question for 3 weeks. Not because it was complicated. What do you actually want is 4 words. It shouldn't require 3 weeks. But because every time I reached for an honest answer, I ran straight into a wall I hadn't fully acknowledged was there. I had spent so long filtering every preference through the question of how it would land with them, that my own wants had become almost completely inaccessible. They were buried under so many layers of anticipating their reaction, managing their feelings, preemptively shrinking my choices to fit inside the space they decided I was allowed to occupy, that when someone asked me what I genuinely wanted with zero agenda attached, I had nothing. And that blankness, that specific horrible silence where my own voice should have been, was the most clarifying thing I had ever felt. Because it didn't make me sad. It made me furious. Not the anxious, guilty, quickly suppressed discomfort I was used to feeling. This was something cleaner and far more dangerous to the dynamic they'd built. This was the anger of someone who has just fully understood, for the first time, exactly what was taken from them. I wasn't grieving a relationship in that moment. I was finally, accurately assessing the damage. I started making a list. Not a dramatic manifesto, just a private, honest inventory of every choice I could trace back to their approval rather than my own genuine desire. The career path pursued because it looked right on the family narrative. The friendships quietly abandoned because they made my mother uncomfortable. The parts of my personality I'd learned to dim in certain rooms because they didn't fit the version of me that kept the peace. The list was longer than I wanted it to be. And somewhere in the middle of it I put the pen down and sat in the full, unfiltered weight of what I was looking at. Here's the part that doesn't make me look strong, but the honest version is more useful to you than the polished one. Even with all that evidence in front of me, my first instinct was still to find a way to make it work. To locate the version of events where I didn't have to make a choice that cost me something. I turned it over for weeks. Had conversations with myself at 2 in the morning that went in exhausting circles. Because here is what nobody tells you about finally seeing a toxic dynamic clearly. Clarity doesn't automatically make leaving feel possible. The familiar prison still has gravity. And that gravity takes everything you have to resist. But something had permanently shifted. I can trace it to one specific moment. I was on the phone with my mother mid-conversation about the wedding, when she said something she had said in various forms my entire life. "I just don't want you to do something you'll regret." And for the first time, instead of absorbing it as concern, I heard it accurately. She was describing her own fear and handing it to me as though it were mine to carry. And I didn't take it. For the first time in 30 years of conditioning, I simply did not pick it up. I hung up. walked into the room where she was reading, and told her exactly what I wanted our wedding to look like. Every detail. No filter. No preemptive compromise, no performance. Just the truth of what I actually wanted, said out loud in my own voice without apology. She looked up and said, "That sounds exactly like you." And I had to turn away because I was crying, not from sadness, but from the unfamiliar, overwhelming relief of being fully known and not punished for it. I had spent my whole life being their version of me. That day I quit. How do you uninvite your own parents from your wedding and know it's the right thing to do? The decision didn't arrive like a thunderbolt. I want to be clear about that because I think there's a version of this story that gets told where the person reaches some cinematic moment of clarity and everything snaps into focus at once. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter and in many ways harder. It was a slow, reluctant, painstaking process of elimination where I kept trying every alternative first and watching each one fail. I tried setting boundaries around the wedding planning. They were ignored with such seamless, practiced ease that I almost admired the technique. I tried having a direct conversation with my mother about how her involvement was affecting me. She cried, I apologized, and nothing changed except that I now felt guilty on top of everything else. I tried distance, less contact, shorter calls, more breathing room. They simply escalated, filling the space I created with more pressure rather than less. I had run out of alternatives before I'd fully accepted that I had run out of alternatives. The conversation with her, my partner, happened on a Sunday morning. No dramatic build-up, no planned agenda. We were just sitting together and I said it out loud for the first time. I said, "I don't think they should be there." And the moment those words existed outside of my head, in actual audible sound, in real space between two people, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. I didn't feel relief. Not yet. I felt grief. Raw, clean, uncomplicated grief for the parents I had needed them to be and never had. For the wedding moment I had quietly carried since childhood. The image of a mother straightening your dress and meaning it, of a father watching you with genuine, uncomplicated pride, and the full understanding that those moments were never going to be available to me. Not because of this decision. They had never been available. I was grieving something I had never actually possessed. I want you to stay with that for a second, because I think it's the most important emotional truth in this entire story. The grief of uninviting them was not the grief of losing something real. It was the grief of finally, permanently, stopping the pretense that it had ever been there. And those are two entirely different kinds of loss. One is about what's being taken. The other is about what you're finally putting down. We talked for hours that Sunday. Every angle, every consequence, every relationship that would be affected, every version of how this could go. And I want to be brutally honest with you right now, I was not brave in that conversation. I cycled through doubt and fear and guilt more times than I can count. I asked out loud whether I was being cruel, whether I was being selfish, whether I would regret this for the rest of my life, whether there was something fundamentally broken in a daughter who could make this choice. These are not rhetorical questions I'm inserting for dramatic effect. I genuinely asked them, and she answered every single one with the same steady patience that had dismantled my defenses from the very beginning. Not by telling me I was right, but by refusing to let me talk myself into being wrong. The actual communication to my parents was not a dramatic confrontation. There was no screaming, no ultimatum, no door slamming moment for anyone to weaponize later. I wrote to them, carefully, clearly, without cruelty and without apology. I told them that the wedding would be moving forward without them, that this decision was final, and that I hoped with time we might find a different way forward. I pressed send. I put the phone face down on the table, and I sat in the silence of what I had just done. I want to be clear, this was not easy, and anyone who tells you it is lying. What do people do when they realize they've lost control over you for good? The first 48 hours after I sent that message were the quietest I had experienced in years. No calls, no responses, just silence, and not the warm, neutral kind, the pressurized kind, the kind that has weight and temperature and intention behind it. I had been bracing for an explosion, and what I got instead was a vacuum, and somehow that was worse. Because silence from people who have spent decades using sound as a control mechanism is not peace. It is preparation. And I knew, with the specific knowing that only comes from a lifetime of studying someone's patterns, that what was being built in that silence was not acceptance. It was strategy. The response, when it came, did not come directly to me. And I want you to notice that detail, because it tells you more about the dynamic than anything I could directly describe. My mother did not call me. My father did not write back. Instead, within 72 hours, my phone began lighting up with messages from people I hadn't spoken to in months. An aunt who had never once shown interest in my relationship was suddenly devastated on my parents' behalf. A cousin who I had maybe exchanged 20 sentences with in the last 3 years was reaching out to let me know how much I was hurting the family. A family friend, someone I had known since childhood, someone I had genuinely liked, sent me a message so precisely worded, so perfectly aligned with my mother's particular rhetorical style, that it could not have been accidental. These were not concerned relatives independently arriving at the same conclusion. This was a network being activated. I was watching a coordinated response unfold in real time, and the clinical part of my brain, the part that had spent years learning to read their patterns, was almost grimly impressed. Here is what I need you to understand about flying monkeys. And I'm using that term deliberately because it has a precise meaning that I think is worth naming clearly. When a person who relies on control loses their direct line of influence over you, they don't simply accept the loss. They recruit. They reframe the narrative to whoever will listen, casting themselves as the wounded party and you as the aggressor. And then they send those people toward you carrying that reframed story as though it were objective truth. And the particularly suffocating thing about this tactic is that the people being sent are not necessarily malicious. Some of them genuinely believed they were helping. Some of them had been given such a convincing, carefully edited version of events that their concern was entirely real, just entirely misinformed. I made a decision in those first 2 weeks that I believe protected my sanity more than almost anything else I did during that period. I stopped explaining myself, not out of arrogance, out of self-preservation, because I had learned, through painful repetition, that every explanation I offered became material. Every clarification I gave was an opening. Every time I engaged with the narrative they were building, I was implicitly accepting that the narrative was a legitimate thing that required my response. And it wasn't. What was happening was not a conversation. It was a campaign. And you cannot have a good faith dialogue with a campaign. The hardest moment, and I have to tell you this because leaving it out would make this story dishonest, came from someone I hadn't expected. Someone close to me, someone I trusted completely outside of my immediate family, pulled me aside and asked whether I had really thought this through, whether I understood what I was throwing away. And they said it with such genuine love that it almost worked. It almost pulled me back into the spiral of self-questioning that I had just barely managed to climb out of. I sat with that conversation for a long time afterward. But here's what I kept coming back to. Every single person expressing concern about what I was losing was focused entirely on the structure of the family. Not one of them asked how I was feeling inside it. And that told me everything I needed to stay the course. What does it feel like to plan the biggest day of your life without walking on eggshells? The first wedding-related decision we made after the fallout settled was so small it should have been meaningless. We were choosing flowers. Just flowers. The kind that would sit on tables and be photographed and then quietly wilt within a week. No politics, no symbolism, no hidden agenda attached to any of it. Just two people in a kitchen with a laptop open, looking at pictures of flowers and deciding what felt like us. And I sat there in the middle of that completely ordinary moment and realized that my shoulders weren't up around my ears. That I hadn't pre-screened a single opinion before offering it. That when she suggested something I didn't love, I just said so directly, easily, without first calculating how my disagreement would land or what it would cost me later. We laughed about it. We moved on. It took approximately 4 minutes and generated 0 casualties. I know that sounds like nothing, but for me, in that specific season of my life, it was everything. Because what I discovered in the weeks of planning that followed was that the version of wedding preparation I had been white-knuckling through before the decision, The version saturated with outside agendas and competing demands and the constant low-grade dread of the next incoming opinion had been so consuming that I had never actually been present inside my own engagement. I had been managing it, surviving it, treating what should have been one of the most joyful seasons of my life like a crisis to be contained. And now, suddenly, without that weight, I had no idea what it actually felt like to just enjoy it. I had to learn that from scratch, which is a strange and quietly heartbreaking thing to have to teach yourself at this stage of life. But there it was. We made every decision together. Just us. The venue was chosen because we both walked in and immediately felt something. Not because it photographed well or impressed anyone or fit a particular image. The guest list was built entirely around people whose presence would genuinely add something to the day, people who had shown up for us consistently and honestly, not people whose absence would require explanation or whose inclusion was a political calculation. Every single element of that day was filtered through one question and one question only. Does this feel like us? And that question, so simple, so obvious, so completely unavailable to me for the entire preceding year, turned out to be the most efficient planning tool I had ever used. I want to tell you about a specific afternoon about 6 weeks before the wedding, because I think it captures something I haven't been able to fully articulate yet. We were doing a final walkthrough of the venue with the coordinator, going through timings and logistics and all the practical machinery of the day. And at one point the coordinator asked me how I was feeling about everything. Just a polite professional question, the kind people ask without necessarily expecting a real answer. And I opened my mouth to give the standard response, and what came out instead was, "Honestly, I can't wait." Just that. 4 words with nothing complicated underneath them. No asterisk, no undercurrent of dread. No part of me privately calculating what was going to go wrong. Just genuine, clean, uncomplicated anticipation. And I remember the coordinator smiling and moving on, and I remember standing there for just a moment afterward thinking, oh, so this is what this is supposed to feel like. The joy wasn't loud. I want to be honest about that because I think there's an expectation that liberation should arrive with some kind of fanfare, some cinematic swell of triumphant feeling. It didn't. It arrived the way good health does after a long illness, not as a dramatic event, but as a quiet, gradual, deeply unfamiliar sense of things simply being okay. Of not waiting for the other shoe. Of making a plan and feeling excited about it rather than braced against it. We were 2 people planning a wedding. Just that. Finally, just exactly that. I woke up on my wedding morning at 5:43 without an alarm. Not from nerves, the distinction matters. I had woken before important days my entire life with anxiety already sitting on my chest, that immediate inventory of everything that could go wrong, everyone who needed managing before I'd had a single conscious thought of my own. That morning there was none of it. What woke me was something I had to lie still for a full minute identifying because it was so unfamiliar. It was excitement. Pure, uncomplicated, belongs entirely to me excitement. And I let myself feel it without immediately searching for what was wrong with it. The getting ready was ours completely. Just the people who had actually shown up throughout the hardest year, friends who had never once made me feel like my choices required their approval, who arrived with coffee and laughter and the specific irreplaceable energy of people who are genuinely happy for you rather than performing happiness at you. Someone spilled something within the first 20 minutes and it became immediately funny rather than catastrophic. I stood in the middle of all of it, hair half done, dress on the back of the door, and felt something settle in my chest I don't have a single clean word for. The closest I can get is belonging. Not the performed, conditional, carefully maintained belonging of my childhood. The kind you don't have to continuously re-earn. I have to tell you about the moment I first saw the venue filled with our people, because it answered a question I hadn't fully admitted I was still carrying. I had told myself the empty seats wouldn't register as absence. I was wrong, and being honest about that matters more than a cleaner narrative. I noticed them. There was a flicker of something. Not regret, not second-guessing, but that same grief from the Sunday morning conversation months earlier. The grief of permanently closing the door on a possibility rather than losing something that had actually existed. I let myself feel it for exactly as long as it needed. And then I looked at the rest of the room. The rest of the room was extraordinary. Not in a grand, overwhelming way, but in the specific irreplaceable way that comes from being surrounded entirely by people whose love has never once carried a hidden condition. I could see it on every face. Not performance, not obligation, not carefully managed social appearance. Just people genuinely, straightforwardly glad to be there. The contrast between that room and the emotional landscape I had navigated for 30 years was so physically palpable, I had to take a breath before I walked in. The ceremony was ours in every syllable. No template, nothing kept purely out of obligation. When I stood across from her and spoke what I had written, I wasn't performing for a room. I was just telling the truth about what she had given me. Not rescue. Not completion. What she had given me was a consistent, completely unguarded mirror. She had simply refused to look away from who I actually was, and in doing so, made it impossible for me to keep looking away from myself. We were pronounced married as late afternoon light came through the windows at an angle that made everything briefly golden. And I thought, this is what I actually deserved. Not as a consolation prize for surviving something difficult. As a baseline. As the minimum standard. As something that should have been obvious from the very beginning, not because I had finally earned it, but because I had never needed to earn it in the first place. That realization didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with something quieter and far more powerful. And tomorrow and every day after it, I decided I was going to live accordingly. What if the family you were born into isn't the family you're meant to keep? I didn't tell this story for sympathy. I want to be completely direct about that from the very first sentence of this final chapter, because if you've made it here all the way through, you deserve the honest version of why this exists. I didn't tell it to villainize two people who will never have the opportunity to give their own account. I didn't tell it to perform healing I haven't fully completed or claim a resolution that is tidier in the telling than it is in the living. I told it because 3 years ago, in the middle of the worst of it, I searched desperately for a voice that sounded like mine describing an experience that felt like mine, and I couldn't find one that didn't either catastrophize the whole thing into trauma porn or minimize it into a tidy 5-step guide to setting boundaries with a bow on top. I needed the complicated, unglamorous, non-linear version, and since I couldn't find it, I decided eventually that I would have to become it. So here is what I actually want to leave you with, and I'm going to say it plainly because you've earned plain by this point. Not every difficult parent is an abusive one. Not every complicated family dynamic requires the same response. I am not standing here telling you that what I did is what you should do, because your situation has variables I will never know. And the distance between reading someone else's story and living inside your own is vast and significant and deserves respect. What I am telling you is that the version of loyalty that requires you to continuously shrink, perform, and override your own instincts in order to maintain a relationship, that is not loyalty. That is self-abandonment dressed in loyalty's clothing. And those two things are not the same, no matter how many people in your life have spent years insisting that they are. Here is the question I get asked most often when people hear pieces of this story, and I want to answer it honestly because I think the honest answer is more useful than the confident one. Do I have regrets? The answer is no, but not for the reason people expect. It's not that the decision was easy or that the fallout didn't cost me anything real. Cost me considerably. It cost me relationships I had valued, a version of family I had still been hoping might one day become what I needed, and a certain kind of uncomplicated social ease that comes from having a conventional family story to tell at dinner parties. Those are not nothing. I'm not going to pretend they are nothing. But what I gained in exchange was not comparable to what I gave up. It was an entirely different category of thing altogether. I gained access to myself, to my own unfiltered, unperformed, unmanaged self. And once you have had that, once you have lived even briefly inside that kind of freedom, the idea of trading it back becomes genuinely unthinkable. The wedding was 8 months ago now. My parents and I have had no contact since the letter. I don't know what the future of that looks like, and I have made a conscious decision to stop trying to predict or control it, which is itself a kind of freedom I didn't have before. What I know is that I wake up in a home that feels like safety, that I am in a partnership where I have never once braced for impact, that I am slowly, imperfectly, with frequent backsliding and the occasional 2 in the morning spiral, learning what it feels like to take up the space I was always supposed to occupy without apologizing for the edges of it. And I know that somewhere in the people watching this right now, there is someone who is exactly where I was 3 years ago, sitting inside a dynamic they can feel is wrong but can't yet fully name, giving every benefit of every doubt, rehearsing conversations before they have them, lying awake doing the math on whether their own needs are reasonable enough to justify the disruption of voicing them, performing a version of themselves that keeps the peace but costs them everything underneath the surface. This is what I want to say to that person directly, and I mean this with every part of the story I have just spent this entire time telling you. You are not too sensitive. You are not being dramatic. You are not ungrateful or selfish or broken for wanting to be loved without conditions attached. The fact that you keep questioning your own perception is not evidence that your perception is wrong. It is evidence of how long and how effectively you have been taught to doubt it. Choosing peace is not the same as choosing wrong. And the life waiting for you on the other side of the hardest decision you will ever make. I cannot promise it will be simple. I cannot promise the people you love won't feel hurt by it. I cannot promise the grief won't be real and heavy and longer than you expected. But I can promise you this. The morning after the hardest thing, when the silence settles and the dust clears and it is just you finally, without the performance and the management and the weight of everyone else's comfort sitting on your chest, that morning you will breathe differently. And you will know, in a way you cannot unknow, that you should have done it so much sooner.